So for the Locke essays, for people who aren't familiar with them, these essays should be 2,000-word essays, again, not counting diagrams, tables of data, footnotes, bibliographies, or authorship declarations. And they can be on a wide variety of prompts and subjects. So just for 2021, I'll take you through I'll just scroll briefly through all of them and then focus on a few of the different questions. So they've got a philosophy section, politics, economics, history, psychology, theology, and law. And I would say, though there are all these different sections, there's a general sort of philosophical bent to the Locke essays. They ask you to do some deep thinking and to consider mostly sort of moral, ethical, political, social prompts. So let me look at, just as a way of getting into discussing how to respond to some of these prompts, I'm going to look at a sample essay and try to just highlight what I think it does really well. And let me just check on the chat real quick, because I see the I see. Does this John Locke carry weight? Yeah, it's really impressive. It's a really impressive award to win. It says at the bottom, it's $2,000 towards the cost of attending any John Locke Institute program. And so it's any award that comes with a it's not $2,000, but it's a scholarship worth $2,000. Any competition that comes with an award worth the equivalent of $2,000, that's going to look especially impressive on an application. And it's associated with Oxford, and Princeton, but probably most closely with Oxford. And so it's associated with these really elite institutions. It's definitely something that looks, I think really sort of top level on a resume. So in terms of, your echelons of awards, this one's definitely in the uppermost echelon, I think, of the awards you could possibly win. Yeah, I think, it's worth giving it a shot, especially if you're somebody who likes to think deeply about philosophical, ethical, social, political type issues. I think it's a great thing to write about. And I will actually say, just briefly, for STEM people out there, I actually think there are awesome opportunities to talk about, STEM issues in STEM, ethical issues in STEM, as maybe case studies that can help you answer some of the prompts. And so we can, look at prompts later that you might, be able to use ethical issues in STEM as possible, case studies for those prompts. But let me take a look at just one of the past essays that I like to look at. And so here's one essay that won the Philosophy Prize in 2019. The prompt was, Aristotelian virtue ethics achieved something of a resurgence in the 20th century. Was this progress or retrogression? Okay. Here's the first paragraph. I'll just read the first two paragraphs of this response, and they're very dense, so stick with me. In the physical world, time measures progress and retrogression as steps along the linear timeline based on the empirical evidentiary facts. These facts are verified or falsified as time passes, which inextricably links time and progress. For example, replacing the heliocentrism with geocentrism is retrogressive because the astronomical evidence accumulated through time discredits the latter. However, progress in philosophy is incompatible with such a view because philosophy belongs to the abstract world, where the lack of empirical factual basis obfuscates the link between time and progress. Hence, a step backward in time does not necessarily equate to retrogression. We cannot say that the Aristotelian concept of justice is retrogressive compared to the Rawlsian concept, purely based on the concept of time. To answer the question, we need to construct a method that measures progress in philosophy. I seek to achieve this by asserting that, in philosophy, a certain degree of falsification is achievable. Utilizing philosophical inquiry and thought experiments, we can rationally assess the logical validity of theories and assign true and false status to philosophical thoughts. With this in mind, I propose to employ the fourth process of the Popperian model of progress. T2 has passed tests which T1 failed to pass, divided into the following two conditions. Okay, I'm not going to get into those conditions, and we're going to stop there for now. I want to note, first of all, that the writing in these two paragraphs is not even very good. This response certainly did not win the prize because the writing was exceptional. It won the prize because of its approach and how rigorously logical and clear it is in its answer to the specific prompt that was asked. So this prompt, if we go back up to it, Aristotelian virtue ethics achieved something of a resurgence in the 20th century. Was this progress or retrogression? These are really the only two key terms in this prompt. And a lot of the Locke prompts, which we'll look at in a little bit, they're like this. They're actually very simple. They don't give you a lot to work with. And so one thing that makes answering the Locke prompt so tricky is that you as the respondent have a lot of work to do up front to specify how exactly are you going to define and measure the terms in the prompt. And this writer does an exceptionally good job defining progress versus retrogression, and then coming up with the specific method she is going to use to actually measure these things. So in the physical world, time measures progress and retrogression as steps along a linear timeline based on empirical evidentiary facts. So this is going to be sort of a counterpoint that she uses to throw into starker relief her point about how in philosophy, progress isn't linear like it is in other realms. So, you know, with science, this writer is essentially arguing we sort of make linear progress. Our scientific instruments become more refined. Our understanding of the facts about the world become more refined, right? And so we simply learn more facts over time. We know some finite number of facts, and we learn more finite number of facts as time goes on, because we simply have more time to learn facts, right? So in science, as a field, there is no such thing really as retrogression. This author is basically arguing. We simply learn more. But the author says progress in philosophy is incompatible with such a view, because philosophy belongs to the abstract world, right? So not the world of tangible and concrete facts, right? Where the lack of empirical factual basis obfuscates the link between time and progress. So a step backward in time does not necessarily equate to retrogression. The more logical way to write this would be a step forward in time does not necessarily equate to progress. But the prompt is about Aristotle, which is in the past. So this author writes, again, according to the prompt, their focus is backwards facing because the prompt asks them to be backwards facing. The prompt says, look into the past. Was this necessarily retrogression? And this author is simply proving right up front, it wasn't necessarily retrogression, simply because we're going backwards. Okay, it's not necessarily a retrogression. The authors proved that in a logical way by comparing how progress works in the physical realm to how progress works in the philosophical realm. And then the author says it's at least theoretically possible. The author has now opened up space to say it's at least theoretically possible that Aristotle's ideas in relation to our own could be progress or retrogression. But how would we measure? What does progress or retrogression mean? What does that actually mean in the context of this prompt? That's not clear at all, simply based on the response, or based on the prompt, sorry. So the response needs to say how it's specifically going to measure progress versus retrogression. And the response does that in a perfect way. To answer the question, we need to construct a method that measures progress in philosophy. I seek to achieve this by asserting that in philosophy, a certain degree of falsification is achievable. Utilizing philosophical inquiry and thought experiments, we can rationally assess the logical validity of theories and assign true and false status to philosophical thoughts. So this is debatable. But this author is saying, I am going to seek to achieve an insightful response to this prompt by asserting something, right? That you just need to accept for the time being. In philosophy, a certain degree of falsification is achievable, utilizing philosophical inquiry, right, and thought experiments, this author says, right? And notice that the author's already telling the reader what's going to come in this essay. So at the same time that the author is establishing what their methodology is, what their sort of standard of measurement is for progress and retrogression, they're also preparing you for what's to come next in this essay, utilizing philosophical inquiry and thought experiments. We can assign true and false status. With this in mind, I propose to employ the fourth process of the Popperian model of progress. T2 has passed tests which T1 failed to pass, divided into the following conditions. So notice that in order to answer this prompt, the writer's actually going to employ a specific model that already exists and that they've done research into understanding. So this is a really great move on the part of this author because it's an opportunity to show that this author's done some research and acquired some tools, some sort of intellectual tools or philosophical tools that the author is going to use to better answer this prompts in a more sophisticated fashion. So of course, you could just sort of muse about Aristotelian virtue ethics and say, well, I like them or I don't like them. But that's not an impressive academic response. Instead, you need to go find some sort of lens through which you can look at Aristotelian virtue ethics. And it doesn't really matter very much what that lens is. It could be anything, at least in theory. But you need some kind of lens. You need to go and find something like this model of progress. And then you need to use that specific model of progress and say, whoops, I need to click that. And so you can say, okay, well, if we narrow our consideration, right, to use just this particular model of progress, now we've set ourselves a goal we could reasonably hope to achieve in 2,000 words. So that's the last thing I'll say before we kind of go back and look at a few more of the prompts. Another good reason why you need to go find another academic lens through which you're going to look at the specific prompt is that you need a lens that's going to narrow down what you need to consider for the prompt. You could write several books about whether Aristotelian virtue ethics, the resurgence of Aristotelian virtue ethics was progress or retrogression. That prompt is much too big to answer. So you, again, need to define and limit what you're actually going to hope to achieve in your response. So this person does that perfectly by going and finding this one particular model they're going to use to measure the progress that this resurgence may or may not have made. So again, just to kind of wrap up or sum up what I've said just about how this person approaches the response, the first big thing is to define the terms in the prompt. And the second big thing is to limit the task that you have to something that you can achieve in 2,000 words. Okay, so with that being said, let's go back and look at some of the prompts. So one of the ones from 2021 that I find most interesting is question number 2 under the economics section. There is considerable excess demand for undergraduate places at Oxford. The admissions process rations supply by favoring cleverer students at the expense of others. Is this fair? Does it exacerbate inequality? What is the university's optimal response to this scarcity? And one of the reasons why I like to use this question, or why I like to consider this question in sort of teaching how to think about your responses, is that it does have so many different terms that you would need to define and sort of delimit in order to craft an effective response. So one thing you should note is that many of the prompts for the Locke essays include assumptions that the people writing the prompts are making. So I would take a look at this sentence, for example. The admissions process rations supply by favoring cleverer students at the expense of others. The assumption this sentence makes is that the admissions process favors cleverer students. As a as a reader, you might actually disagree even with that assumption. You might say, well, actually, what the admissions process does is that it favors students from places with better high school education systems, because it's not that the students who are getting into Oxford are inherently cleverer than the students who aren't. It's that the students at Oxford enjoyed better educations up to this point in their lives, for example. And so one thing you can do in a prompt is you need to be clear, first of all, whether you agree with the assumptions that the prompt is making and whether you're going to accept them or not as you write the prompt. But let's even say that you accept the assumption and you don't want to quibble with it in your response. You just want to leave the assumption alone. There are still a bunch of terms in this response that you need to define. Is this fair? Is this fair according to what metric? Remember how the respondent in the philosophy essay we just read established such precise metrics for everything she was going to discuss. Is this fair by what metric and in what sense? Does it exacerbate inequality? Again, how can we hope to measure something like that? Do you have stats from past studies that try to measure particularly how university admissions processes affect inequality? And do you have philosophical lenses you might look through to judge what inequality is in the first place and whether it's inherently a bad thing? So that's another thing you could consider. This prompt seems to assume that inequality is a bad thing. Is inequality inherently bad? Of course, these days, mostly we talk about it like it is, and there are plenty of types of inequality that are bad for very easily justifiable reasons. But in your response, you need to establish if inequality is bad, why is it, and in what ways is it bad, and what does it mean to exacerbate inequality, and how can we measure that? So again, you need to figure out how to measure those things. And what is the university's optimal response to this scarcity? Again, notice we're talking, even in this prompt, we're talking in measurement words. What is optimal? What is best? In scarcity, right? Again, the scarcity of spaces that are available at Oxford. But optimal is the most key word that you would need to define. What is the university's optimal response to this scarcity? So you need to figure out, what should the university's primary goals be in responding most ethically or equitably to the scarcity that certainly does exist? What should the goals be? What should the university be trying to achieve? And then how could it optimally achieve that particular goal? And that would help you to craft an effective response to this question. Okay. So there are plenty of other questions that we could look at, but I just briefly before we end, I want to cover prompts that you could look at if you are a STEM person. Are there some subjects about which we should not even ask questions? This is under philosophy, but you could easily think through this question by presenting some experiences you might have as a STEM person. So I like to use the sort of generic example of people considering whether we should alter the genes of unborn babies if we, or soon to be born babies, if we discover through sort of pre-birth testing that they're going to be born with some sort of disease or cognitive difference. So this is a difficult question to ask. And you could use that question as a case study to think through the larger question of, are there some questions about which we should not even ask questions? And there are similar prompts where, you could discuss your own personal experiences. Are you more moral than most people you know? How do you know? Should you strive to be more moral? Why or why not? Of course, it's a question about morality, but it's also a question that asks you to discuss your own life. Are you more moral than most people you know? How do you know? Should you strive to be more moral? Why or why not? And if you're asked to discuss your own life and your life largely revolves around STEM stuff, then you should discuss some of your experiences in your STEM fields in that response. So there are plenty of opportunities to discuss these prompts if you're a STEM person, even though the prompts are obviously more on the humanities side of things. Okay, so let me stop my screen share since I know we only have a couple of minutes left. And oh, I see. So the questions are mostly logistical at this point. When 2022 prompts come out, usually January. Yeah, and you have to be 18 years or younger. Yeah, and there's a junior prize, but I think probably most people in this chat are in just the normal group of students who would submit essays to the contest.